Hello, everyone. Welcome to BetaBagels number 8. My name is Kate Nicholson, and I work at BetaNYC, and I run our events and partnerships and have a background in design for social innovation. This morning, we're going to be doing we're going to be having our BetaBagels, which is our event series, our morning briefing event series. And we're happy to have with us today the Mayor's Office of the Chief Technology Officer. And we will be discussing the recently published Internet of Things strategy that they just put out. And we really look forward to hearing from you and hearing what questions you have about the Internet of Things strategy that New York City will be adopting, and what you think should be in it, what shouldn't, what any concerns are, what excites you, etc. We have 2 links to share, and I actually think the slides link is not yet active, but it will be soon. The Slido link you see, sli.do/BetaBagels008, is a place to ask questions, respond to a few prompts, and share general feedback if you have any questions or want to talk and discuss things anonymously or as yourself. So welcome. And today's agenda, we'll just quickly be getting started. We'll introduce you to our guests, then we'll hear from them, and then we'll engage in some Q&A, feedback, and discussion. And then we're gonna hang here a little bit after, from 10:30 to 10:45 here on Zoom. If you wanna stick around, network, say hi to whomever, and meet each other. So for the 5th time, welcome. Noel over here is where the BetaBagels is pointed. I'm at home because my internet connection is slightly better than our mesh network at the Manhattan Borough President's Office. But we welcome everybody from New York City and everyone from outside of New York City if you're here with us this morning. Now I'm gonna hand over the, I'm not gonna pass over the floor yet. So for all of our events, we like to just sort of recognize, I just showed you where we are here in New York City, in Manhattan. This is specifically Lower Manhattan, and the arrow is pointing to the Manhattan Borough President's Office at the Municipal Building, which is right over the Brooklyn Bridge. And this section of New York is an important place. It has a very interesting history, and we like to just sort of shout out that we weren't the first people to be here, and recognize the people that came before us, specifically the Lenape people. We like to sort of think of ourselves and our work and what we do as being stewards for the future. So we hope to take a different approach to some that have come before us, and continue to bring in better things. And that is why those things like BetaBagels. So BetaBagels is an experimental breakfast salon that we have been hosting in the mornings generally for people to understand what's going on in New York City government with regards to technology, data, and design. And we normally host it at the Manhattan Borough President's Office. And we normally have lots of bagels and coffee and are in person, but it's really nice that we can connect with everybody here virtually as well. I'm going to pass the floor over to Gabby, my colleague, who will tell you a little bit more about BetaNYC before we get started.
Hi, thanks, Kate. Yeah, so just a little bit more about BetaNYC. We're a civic organization that improves the lives of New Yorkers through civic technology, design, and open data. And our work supports the city in achieving digital literacy and open data for all. Now, here we have a quote from Cesar Chavez, which says, "The fight is never about grapes or lettuce. It is always about people." And, we like to adopt this quote, especially in the People's Roadmap, which is sacred to us because, using the words of Beta, we look at it as technology as a catalyst for empowerment and bridging municipal management inequalities. So we definitely hold this quote very true to our hearts.
So yeah, so like Gabby said, we have some core foundational freedoms at the basis of our work. We work to connect, we think that everybody has the freedom to connect, to learn, to innovate, and to collaborate. And we try to embody that in all of our work. And what we do is we're slowly sort of like bringing it all into a picture that is easy to understand. But we think of ourselves as sort of an ecosystem that can respond to civic needs, public needs around open data and civic technology. So we run a thing called Radar, which is a data assistance, research and data assistance requests. That's what it stands for. And it's essentially a help desk for folks to request any support around data or research that they have that are sort of one-off requests that they might not have time to do. So specifically with government offices, community organizations, they use that, and we help create data analysis maps and different things to support their work. We also do a lot of public engagement, and we also work to improve the civic tech talent pipeline by bringing more diversity to it and ensuring that everybody has a say in and feels equipped to use open data, design and technology, and understand how it's working in the city. Before we get started, I want to just quickly thank you, some of our supporters, specifically the Office of Gail Brewer, Manhattan Borough President. I don't know if Jessica or Daniel is here with us today, but they would love to say hello either way. And normally we host it in their office, and they've been great hosts for us for workspace and for events like these. And then we are supported by the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, as well as the Rockefeller Brothers Foundation, which we don't have in here. And before we get started, a quick shout out to our LA friends who started off with data and donuts and were the original inspiration for BetaBagels. And now I'm gonna just quickly share a bit about our guest today. So we're joined by two members from the New York City Chief Technology Officer's Office. And their mission is to ensure that technology is inclusive, accessible, human-centered, and works for all New Yorkers. So they're responsible for making sure that technology is being used and being integrated into society in a fair and equitable way. And we're specifically going to be talking about their recent report, which is all about how the Internet of Things, or IoT, or connected devices, will be used in the city. And their report is really long, but they did break it down into a summary for us, and which was emailed last night. So if you didn't get it and you signed up today, we'll send it around again. But the main sort of gist is, the Internet of Things is growing around the world, and sensors are being installed in devices, and there's a lot of opportunity in this space and a lot of exciting opportunities to make things more effective and efficient. But there's also a lot of risk and a lot of things that we need to consider. So what should we be considering? How will our use and the sort of like the deployment of IoT around the city affect areas like transportation, utility services, resiliency, health, safety, quality of life? How will it affect certain communities versus others? What should we be thinking about? So the 6 areas that they've broken down and are going to tell us a little bit more about today, where IoT is going to be, where they're thinking around, the 6 topics they're sort of thinking about it with regards to the strategy are governance and coordination, privacy and transparency, security and safety, fairness and equity, efficiency and sustainability, openness and public engagement. And we're excited to have you here today because I know people sort of are ranging from knowing a whole lot about one specific area, like security, for instance, or people are varying from having no idea what questions they should even be asking. So I'm somewhere in the middle personally, and I know some others are as well. And I am excited to hear what questions people have and just sort of hear how some topics that I've been hearing a lot, like artificial intelligence, how will that affect Internet of Things? Like that's a whole nother level of Internet of Things. So what should we be hearing from? And we want BetaNYC's community to be here because you all have great expertise and insight into various things, and it's important that those are brought into this conversation. So today is very much around informing you about the strategy and getting feedback from you on it. So without further ado, I will introduce you to Kate Homan and Paul Rothman. They are both at the New York City Mayor's Office, the Chief Technology Officer. Kate is the Director of Research and Future Planning and leads research planning and reporting efforts related to emerging technologies and their role in city government across society. And you've served in city government for over a decade, and you have a PhD in sociocultural anthropology from Columbia, in music from Barnard. And Paul led the development of the IoT strategy and helps guide the integration of technology systems and policies for continuous modernization of IoT tech and related civic issues to meet public needs. And fun fact, I didn't know this, but you were the founding member of Littlebits Electronics. If anyone else is familiar with Littlebits, really cool company. Or a STEAM education technology startup, and graduate of NYU, and also have bachelor's in music technology and a master's from ITP. So very cool. And I'm gonna hand the floor over to you now. But before I do, we want to know what your favorite bagel is. So please let us know when you introduce yourselves.
All right, thanks so much. Thanks so much, Kate, and everybody from BetaNYC. And from the whole BetaBagels community. If I can switch over to share my screen, I will jump into our presentation. Are we good on your end? All right. Well, great. Thank you so much. As Kate mentioned, we're going to be talking about the New York City Internet of Things strategy that we released in March. Again, I'm Paul Rothman, the director of our Smart Cities and IoT Lab.
Sorry, I'm Kate Homan, Director of Research and Future Planning, favorite bagel, everything.
Oh, right, yes. Also, for me, everything bagel, plain tofu, cream cheese, and tomato. Okay. So for the purpose of this conversation today, we're looking to gather feedback on the content of the strategy. In 1 second, just because I have this window that is blocking my screen. Let's try again. Okay. Great. So yeah, we're gathering feedback on the content and the recommendations that we made in the IoT strategy. And we're really interested in understanding how, what we put forward relates to the residents and stakeholder needs. We want to hear about if there's anything that wasn't included that people think would be considered helpful or needed. And all of this information that we're gathering, we've also been doing a bunch of other stakeholder engagements from different parts of New York City, from community organizations to other civic groups and industry partners. So we're going to be doing a follow-up on the IoT strategy itself towards the end of the year, pulling in a lot of the information, the feedback that we've been gathering as somewhat of a epilogue or follow-up based on information that we've gathered. So as Kate mentioned, it's long. I have heard from people who have not written it that it is actually pretty concise and easy to read through. So if you are really interested in the topic, I would suggest taking a read through. So what we're going to talk about today, I'm going to do kind of a brief intro on what is IoT, because I know maybe not everybody is quite up to speed at the same level. So I'll do a brief intro. We'll talk about what's in the IoT strategy, the principles, some examples of IoT being used in the city. We'll talk through some of the selected strategy recommendations, talking about some of the next steps that we've proposed, I'm going to give a few updates on some of the projects that were mentioned in the IoT strategy. We're going to pose a couple of questions to the community itself, and then we'll have time for Q&A. So what is IoT? So the term IoT stands for the Internet of Things. It's used to describe sensors or actuators, other electronic devices that either transmit or receive data via the internet, typically autonomously. They're not necessarily, requiring human interaction. And then the data that IoT, or also known as connected devices, collect, it can be used independently to inform operational or design decisions. So something like, I got an alert that something has happened that I need to address, or the information can be used within a larger system to control a system or condition. So, building sensors might be, aggregating their data to make decisions about heating or cooling or other building systems might be used in aggregate. And then this is a diagram included in the IoT strategy, just giving kind of example about the flow of information. So on the left, we have a couple of different types of sensors, like temperature sensors, a people counter, water level monitor. They're each highlighted as communicating over different protocols. So BLE for one, Wi-Fi, or LoRa is another IoT communications protocol. Each one of those sensors needs to communicate to a gateway. So that could either be your smartphone, which is connected to the internet. It could be a wireless Wi-Fi router. It could be a LoRaWAN gateway. And that is what's known as the backhaul, the connection to the internet itself. And then on the internet, you've got some sort of cloud platform that's going to be ingesting that data, perhaps visualizing it and making it actionable or useful. And then you're going to have a device, a smartphone, a tablet, or computer that is going to be your end device that the user is going to interact with and actually understand that data. Or, the other situation that I mentioned was where sometimes these systems are happening autonomously, and there might be a lighter touch, from a user, because there could be pre-programmed rules or things, for example, like a building system. And now Kate is going to jump in to talk about the IoT strategy itself.
Sure. So, over the last decade, the city has increased its use of IoT broadly, and that work was generally undertaken by individual agencies, sort of as opportunities were presented. In about 2015, the city began a set of efforts to sort of organize its approach to IoT. So in 2015, we released a report that highlights a set of case studies describing how the city was using IoT at that time, to sort of illustrate the range of ways it could be used and the kinds of operational and service improvements that could be achieved with the use of IoT. In 2016, we launched a major research effort engaging with stakeholders across sectors in New York and across the world, and sort of distilled the more than 450 best practices that were gleaned from those engagements into a set of guidelines for the government's use of IoT. And that work is really a key piece of the foundation for this strategy. We've also been engaged over this time period in a set of initiatives, in particular within our office, launched a number of pilots and initiatives, stakeholder engagements, towards sort of organizing the city's approach and sort of learning about how to best use IoT and govern IoT. And then in 2019, in the One NYC 2050 plan, the mayor made a formal commitment to centralize the city's approach to IoT and publish a citywide IoT strategy. And so this document is the realization of that commitment. Paul, can you go to the next slide? Thanks. And so the document broadly, our broad goal is to outline a set of steps to support a healthy cross-sector IoT ecosystem in the city, which we talk about as being one that is productive, responsible, and fair. The document itself includes a review of that prior city work that I outlined, an outline of the key sort of guiding principles that we use in thinking about a healthy ecosystem, which Paul will talk about in more detail next. it provides some basic information about what IoT is and sort of components in IoT systems, describes the landscape of how IoT is being deployed across sectors in the world generally, and then particularly in New York City. It identifies a set of key opportunities and challenges that we saw as present toward creating a healthy ecosystem locally, and then outlines a set of recommendations and specific steps the city is planning to take toward achieving that goal.
Great, and so now I'll talk a little bit more detail about some of the principles that were mentioned before. So these 6 principles, 2-part principles, talking about privacy and transparency. And again, just to reiterate, these principles that apply to New York City and how we're going about our use of IoT, but within the strategy, we're also framing this as principles for broader IoT use. So for the private sector, for industry, we believe that these principles should apply to any use of IoT. So privacy and transparency, we're really talking about protecting and respecting privacy and being open and transparent about the data that's collected. Openness and public engagement, making the data accessible, especially around around data ownership, and people that own the device should be owning the data as well, and identifying any impacts from the use and engaging with the public about its use. For governance and coordination, we're talking about maintaining oversight and coordination to really ensure a consistency and efficiency with the use of the technology. And then with efficiency and sustainability, utilizing shareable and reusable resources and considering environmental impacts when using the technologies. With security and safety, we're thinking about designing, deploying, and maintaining projects with security and safety in mind. And then fairness and equity, creating projects, and analyzing them and correcting them for bias and disparate impacts. And so within the strategy itself, we go into details about how, we're trying to sort of live these principles in many of the projects that are being undertaken in New York City. And also I'll segue into some examples of IoT and NYC here. And so in the IoT and NYC strategy, in the document itself, it goes into a lot more detail. There's more examples of different city agency and how they're using it, but I just pulled out a couple of examples here. On the top left, we've got the bike counter that DOT has installed on the Manhattan side of the Manhattan Bridge. And so this is data that's being collected with privacy in mind. It's using a conductance sensor underneath the asphalt. So it's basically just, it knows when a bicycle has passed over it. It's not taking any other rider information or anything like that. That information is then being displayed directly to the public at the site where the data is being collected. So on that post, you'll see the number of riders per day that have crossed the bridge, and you'll also see the number of riders over the course of a year that have crossed that bridge. And then that data is also made available by DOT through their website as sort of aggregate data over the course of time. One thing that we mentioned in the strategy, which I don't think we particularly touched upon in detail here, but thinking about the idea of pulling many data sources that the city is steward to a single sort of dashboard, an IoT data dashboard, which we talk about, and we've done some work on that in the office. And that's something that we're recommending, to make it easier for not only city agencies to share data, but for public to have access to more near real-time data. On the bottom left, you've probably seen these boxes around the city. There's over 800,000 of these water meters around located on city or on buildings within the city. So these meters assess the water usage within buildings and create an efficiency in that that the city doesn't need to send people to read individual meters, but also it provides more accurate data and then can potentially provide information about a building being used that may not be sort of shouldn't be available to use, things like ghost buildings or zombie buildings that are being used or not used based on water usage information. On the top right, we have one of the air quality monitors, which is a partnership with CUNY Queens College. And this is a part of the larger New York City Community Air Survey project. And so there are several of these real-time air quality monitors that are used to gather real-time data around the city. And that's an example of one of the academic partnerships, some of the kind of partnerships that we try to do within the city on a research basis. I'd say the two previous ones, those are more about sort of product procurement. And then the bottom right, City Bike, which folks might not think of as IoT, but all of those stations are connected to the internet, providing information back to you through the app, where bikes are, things like that. So that is very much an IoT application and an example of a public-private partnership that the city has around IoT. And then just to kind of dive in a little bit deeper on two examples, this project, which is another partnership between the city, the CTO's office, the Mayor's Office of Climate Resiliency, CUNY and NYU, we're working together to develop hardware and a software system to do real-time flood monitoring. And so this is the first time such a project is taking place in New York City. Most of the current data about flooding happens through resident reporting, either through the Flood Watch program or 311. There's also meteorological data and modeling. And so with the help of CUNY and NYU, you can see a sensor mounted to a street sign here in Gowanus. We're able to get real-time data about flooding, which provides really interesting information, not only about when it floods, but we're able to sort of see the kind of signature, like how long does it take for a flood to dissipate and things like that, which is new and useful information. The tools that are being developed are open source. So the sensors, all the information is available on GitHub, and we're working on a data dashboard that will be providing information directly back to the communities that are affected. Right now, the focus areas in Gowanus and Hamilton Beach out near the Jamaica Bay. But this data is also going to be available for city agencies and academic researchers. And then hopefully this project could be funded further in order to expand to other affected communities. On another end of the spectrum, if that last project was maybe a little bit more grassroots in terms of, we're developing hardware ourselves, it's a small pilot. The automated traffic enforcement program that the Department of Transportation has to improve public safety. So there's speed cameras that are used around the city to enforce speed limits, specifically in school zones. This was first launched in 2014, and then due to some law changes in 2019, all 750 school zones have these speed cameras, and the speed cameras identify vehicles traveling 10 miles per hour or above this posted speed limit. An image is captured of the license plate, and then a $50 notice of liability is sent to the vehicle owner. And there's data that shows that speeding declines by more than 60% in the zones with cameras, and most of the people who got a ticket didn't receive a second ticket. And so, enforcing our speed limits and other, street laws for public safety, for Vision Zero, to ensure, that traffic violence is minimized as best we can. These automated enforcement tools are an effective use of IoT and can potentially save lives. So now we're going to talk a bit about some of the selected recommendations that were put into the strategy itself.
Great, and I'm going to speed through this a little bit because I do want to make sure we have plenty of time for questions, and we can hear from everybody who has them. So just a quick, this is just, as Paul said, this is a selected set of recommendations. We make recommendations, they're organized by three categories based on sort of who's targeted with the recommendation. So we have a set of recommendations related to government, some recommendations around building city government's capacity to use IoT, some recommendations around supporting innovation in the city's use, some recommendations around data sharing among agencies and with the public, some recommendations around fostering partnerships across sectors to support the city's efforts, and some recommendations around coordination and oversight to make sure that the city's efforts are aligned and are deployed responsibly. We have a set of recommendations that are focused on residents and how they're impacted by IoT. So we have some recommendations around public education, awareness and training to support New Yorkers to have agency in their interactions with IoT across society. We have some recommendations around transparency and accountability to the public for the city's use of IoT. Some recommendations to ensure that New Yorkers have equitable access to workforce opportunities that IoT will bring, and some sort of policy and legislative oriented recommendations to protect New Yorkers in their interactions with IoT across a variety of settings. And then we have a set of recommendations that are sort of more focused on businesses and community organizations. So some recommendations to support the development and use of industry policy standards and best practices toward responsible use of IoT. Some recommendations around supporting the city's collaboration with communities and community organizations, and to support local and particularly MWBE product sourcing for the city's IoT needs. And then we outline a set of particular next step actions. I encourage you to look at the details in the strategy on this. It's a short 2-page summary, but these are the categories that those steps fall in. But really we seek to address like all of those recommendation areas with the next steps that we outline. So the categories here are steps to foster innovation, steps to promote data sharing and transparency, improve governance and coordination, derive value from cross-sector partnerships, and engage with industry and advocate for communities.
And so I'm just going to share a couple of updates since the strategy came out on the coordination and sort of internal collaboration and capacity building. We've started the Smart City Collaborative. So that is basically a list of representatives from different city agencies that can be connected to one another when opportunities come up, either about specific projects or grant funding or any type of opportunity that might benefit from agencies disseminating information throughout their internal networks. And then we also started the IoT Forum, which the first one took place in May. And so this is a forum for city employees who are working in IoT technology in order to exchange knowledge and collaborate. And this is modeled after a couple of other programs within the city around data analytics that the Mayor's Office of Data Analytics runs. Also the Civic Design Forum is another example. So it's really about bringing practitioners within the city together. And this is going to be a quarterly gathering. So the next one is going to be in August or September. Transparency signage is something that we're piloting now. So I mentioned the Flood Net project before. And so we are testing out some designs that we've created about signage that basically would inform somebody passing by. They see, a piece of electronics on a pole or a street sign, this sign is supposed to tell you, the who, what, why, where, how of a particular project. And so we have a couple of those signs posted for the flood sensors. We've got 2 more projects coming up this year that we're going to be testing these out in, and we're going to be gathering some feedback, doing some user research on, the information that's being presented and how, it could be better to inform people and make what the technology is being used for more transparent. We also have what is described as rapid IoT in the strategies. This is really thinking about how the city can utilize sort of low cost or open source technologies to gather real-time data in a quicker and more cost-effective way, instead of going through a vendor procurement process, how we can kind of take and use technology ourselves within the city. And so the first project that we're doing is a collaboration between our office, Department of Transportation, Mayor's Office of Climate and Resiliency, and then we're also partnering with USDR, which is the US Digital Response, who are providing a volunteer to help us work on the data science aspect of this. And this is essentially, we're going to be deploying some temperature and humidity sensors over the summer to understand street level heat, and basing this around heat vulnerability index from different neighborhoods. So we've got a couple of different neighborhoods that have different levels of heat vulnerability. And we're going to be deploying these sensors to understand what mitigation techniques are potentially providing the best amount of cooling, whether or not that's a cool street with an open hydrant or tree cover, artificial sprays or things like that. So that's going to be new data for the city that we'll be able to use to better mitigate heat. And we're using LoRaWAN on the Things Network, which might be something that this community is aware of. I know the Manhattan Borough President's Office has been keen on using that in the past. And then the last project I'll mention is the impact assessments. And so we're currently working on a draft PIA for that project that we'll be developing internally, and then doing user research and sharing that with civic organizations. The idea being that when a technology is being used, there will be a document explaining what it is, why it's being used, etc., and we'll be able to receive comments on that to understand, residents' opinions about that technology and how it's being used. So a couple of questions for the community, just to kind of start the conversation before we jump into Q&A. Thinking about digital rights, are things like the impact assessment and although we didn't mention this, privacy by design policies, which is what we're advocating for in the strategy. Are there more that can be done to work on preserving digital rights? Are there additional steps the city should consider regarding private sector IoT use? In terms of equity, how can the government best engage with communities on this IoT work? And are there other measures that we might consider to support equity in local ecosystems? On transparency, is there additional information that residents want or need when it comes to the use of IoT? And then on privacy and security, what are the concerns that residents have? How might the city best understand and respond to those concerns across diverse applications? And then from there, we're going to jump into Q&A. So I will stop our screen sharing. And then, the BetaNYC folks, if you want to jump in to help moderate. But yeah, thanks just again for having us. We're really happy to present this work and happy to field questions about it.
Thank you so much. That was really informative. So do you want people to respond to some of the things you just laid out at the end there, or do you want to jump right into the Q&A?
I mean, if people want to raise, I don't know what's the most organized way to do it. I mean, I guess if there's already questions in the queue, that might be easier. But I guess if folks also have questions, there's like the raise hand function, or, I think maybe using the chat.
Yeah, I'll share my slide so you can see the questions that people have already asked. But everybody, oh, I see one hand raised. Joel, feel free, yeah, come on off and you can answer. If you just want to raise your hand, if you don't want to go to the Slido to ask a question, raise your hand and we'll just alternate between. And if you raise your hand, just come off your mic when you're called on. So Joel, go ahead if you want to kick us off.
Yeah, thanks for the presentation first of all, and BetaNYC for hosting this. My question relates to the experience in Toronto, the Smart Toronto initiative that ultimately fell through. Are there any lessons learned? I see a lot of the questions you have on transparency and privacy, I think echo some of the concerns I thought were expressed by the community there. And I was just wondering if there are any other particular things you've done to address some of those concerns. One concern of mine that I see some mention of in the strategy is, it's well and good that a lot of these data through public-private partnerships will need to be maintained by private sector firms who have business models, that are sustainable. But the concern there, I think, that was in Toronto was what will prevent these private sector firms from selling the data to third parties who may use that data for something that is not exactly aligned with the city's.
Sure, no, and that's
needs.
a great question. And from our standpoint, when we are engaging with private companies around the use of some of their sensor technology, we're relying on our legal agreements and contracts. And so what I think I mentioned before around data ownership and the principles, we are, the city is taking a position that, if we're paying for data, the city is the owner of that data. And so, we've had negotiations with companies who, have perhaps wanted to, a part of their business model is maybe, selling that data, that, that's how they support some of their business. But, we've been pretty clear in our negotiations and conversations with companies that, the city is paying for the data. In some cases, we may license the data back for specific uses. Like if that data is going to be used to, improve the service that the city is being provided, there might be a limited condition of licensing data back to the company for a specific purpose of improving their product. But yeah, I think it's really important that it's clear that the city is owning the data that it's collecting, and then also collecting that data on behalf of the people of New York, and sharing that data back through open data or other platforms. Not all the data that's collected can be done that way because of some sensitivities, but where possible, that's the goal. Should we just jump in and read off some of these questions?
Yeah, we can start from the oldest and then just go through them, if that works with you.
Sure. So the question about outreach and documentation about high school students and after school teachers to interface and use the IoT network. Yeah, so that's something that we've been thinking about, and seeing how IoT might be integrated into education curriculum, either in like the K through 12 or through continuing ed and workforce development. We're having some conversations about folks with companies that could potentially provide some of those education tools. And in terms of and we sort of consulted with the Department of Education during the research of this strategy. There is curriculum around physical computing, which is essentially using hardware to gather data. There's not curriculum around getting data to the cloud for IoT use, but there is potential for that to happen in the future. We mentioned a use case of a great program in PS 28, I believe, in Jersey City, a school that's using the Things Network, and a group of really great enterprising young girls who are doing environmental sensing. And so, potentially through after school programs and trying to develop capacity, outside of the kind of the curriculum as kind of a pilot is potentially a good way to get started. I'm currently working as a part of the rapid IoT project I mentioned around heat vulnerability. We're installing a Things Network gateway on the roof of PS 189 in Brooklyn. So that's central Brooklyn, Brownsville, Crown Heights border. And that's an area that doesn't currently have coverage to the Things Network. And so through some of our partnerships that we have through our Collabs program in Brownsville, we're going to be looking into seeing what sort of education programs we might be able to develop or work with community partners to try to get the word out around using IoT in an education setting.
Yeah, that's a great question, because it's, the future of the city is the students, and if they're not equipped to be able to use and understand the technologies and things that are running at the city, how will they stay ahead of it? So, nice question.
So the next question: if sensors are installed, who maintains them, deinstalls them, recycles them after the pilot funding timeline has expired? Who does the hardware belong to? So that can be kind of on a case-by-case basis, depending on the project. In some cases, like a smaller pilot, like the ones that I talked about that our offices are involved in, we're working with, let's say, academic partners to install and maintain them. Hopefully technology that is reusable and not needing to be recycled. But it varies in terms of some of the bigger projects like the water meters. Some of those projects might be contracted out to vendors who are doing the installation and maintenance. And so, yeah, it really depends on what the project is. Sometimes we're the DOT, if we're using the street poles to install devices, the DOT team might be doing it. There are contractors that also do this work, like licensed electrical contractors that the city uses. We did some installations as a part of our office's Collabs program in 2019 in Brownsville, some interactive lighting installation where we contracted with a local electrician firm to do those installs. So yeah, it varies, but hopefully that answers the question. Next question is, if data is captured, how much data is stored and for how long, and at what point is enough data to make a political decision? Data capture can last years and nobody wants to actually make a decision. Yeah, so I guess it also depends, again, like some of these programs are, evergreen, right? Like there's no end date. Like, again, going back to the water meters, those aren't time bound. That's information that's always going to be useful. in terms of the data being stored, I think it's probably on a case-by-case basis. Some of that data, hopefully as much as possible, is going into open data. So, I mean, I guess there's a question about data cap, like how long is it being captured versus how long is it being stored? We've had some conversations with the Department of Public Records, who are kind of traditionally dealing with paper records, but more now digitizing records and things like that. So those are conversations that that are ongoing and that we've had, but I think in some cases, it depends. I would be curious, from the person asking that question, is there, certain types of data where there's a concern about capturing that data? Something like environmental data, obviously, that's useful to have over time. We can see about, changes in the city environment. And so, that's useful information to have, but I would be curious to hear about what specific data are people concerned about, being stored for longer periods of time.
It kind of been a question of like, is there a place that you can go to ask or understand why data is being collected, if it's being collected? Is it being collected for one decision to be made, or for over real-time decisions to be made constantly?
Sure, yeah, and I think that goes back to what we're trying to do with the privacy and equity impact assessments, which are supposed to lay that out. And so, we've been looking to other cities. I think with GDPR, those types of impact assessments have been more common in European countries that have been affected by GDPR, but we've looked at other places. Seattle has had impact assessments for a number of years that we've been referencing. So, hopefully all of those, criteria and information that people are concerned about or interested about will be laid out, and people can comment ahead of deployments. So next question is, what happens to data captured by sensor networks in public spaces? Is it in a data store? Does GDPR-like data governance apply? Can someone request their data if it's civic data? How is it made clear it isn't personal or identifiable? Sorry, I just lost the question again. Okay. One second, I'm just trying to read the question again. So in terms of where is the data stored, I think it's, again, it's going to be sort of case by case to some extent. There is a recommendation that we're putting forward, as I think I mentioned before, in terms of this IoT data dashboard, that we can kind of aggregate data as much as possible. But, a lot of times data that's being collected by a particular agency is sort of retained within that agency. And, there are data sharing agreements that can happen between agencies, but the data is probably not as accessible between agencies as it might be otherwise. And so that's an effort that we're looking to pursue. And yeah, in terms of data governance, there are requirements. There are documents that both our Department of IT and Telecom have, as well as the Cyber Command office, around data types. And then within the document itself, the IoT strategy, we talk about different types of data and how how it can be categorized and the sensitivities of it. And so, in terms of requesting their own data, as much as possible, again, trying to implement privacy by design principles that were minimizing, personally identifiable information. So that's really the intention, only gathering, specifically the information that's needed. how will NYC get agencies to comply? So right now, that's, we're trying to do that through outreach and engagement. There are no legal sort of frameworks in place around this specific information, aside from the Post Act around NYPD usage of certain connected technologies. That's the only legal framework that I'm aware of. So yeah, right now, it's a question of trying to disseminate this information using those tools I mentioned before, the Smart City Collaborative, as we're doing internal education around these initiatives. But I think it's going to be some time to sort of get people to change how they go about doing things. But we're doing that through outreach and engagement, and from our office perspective, trying to help people with their projects and do them in a responsible way. Around security, there are more restrictions, and so there are processes in place that like NYC Cyber Command has, and also like cloud review processes for using cloud-based softwares. And so some of those could be connected to funding and spending. Like you need to get basically like certified through an internal process before you can spend money. But that also depends on how much money is being spent and things like that. So it's that's definitely a work in progress. There's a question on the top. There's mention of a smart city catalog. Will portions of it be publicly available? Specifically metadata would be great supplement to the physical transparency signage, and it can be used to power digital map. Yeah, so the smart city catalog, the city does a lot of great work with this technology. The information about it is not always centralized, and so you could go on different agency websites and see about how DEP is using the technology, or DOT, and apologies if I'm using acronyms that people don't know, Department of Environmental Protection or Department of Transportation. And so the idea of the Smart City Catalog is really trying to aggregate those different projects, not only for residents, but also as a model for other cities. We get inbound from cities from around the world asking about different projects and how IoT and smart city technology is being used. So just trying to kind of be as open and transparent about those projects as possible. And so along with that, and that's something that's it's a work in progress. We have a small office, and so we're a little bandwidth constrained, but hoping to be able to work on those digital assets, that catalog, as well as the transparency signage, and then hopefully have a map, not necessarily being something, I don't know, it says could be used to power a digital map. That's hopefully something, the direction that we want to go into, that the city would provide. Amsterdam has a map that they've created of an IoT registry where you can see where the devices are around the city. That's something that, along with the IoT data dashboard that I mentioned, is an ambition of ours to try to make available to residents.
Paul, I have a follow-up question on that.
Mm-hmm.
So DoIT has this kind of like service catalog of, organizations and software. How is the IoT being considered as part of this, service catalog of things? I guess, what other types of credentialing and like seal of approval are you considering putting into kind of like the realm of IoT that could be potentially offered within existing vendors?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's a great question. Something that we've talked about. And so, I mentioned the cloud review process and the cyber security review, which includes things like penetration testing, and they really kind of dig into the technology in a thorough manner. there is hesitancy, I guess, to say that like we could say, yes, we've used this, but every technology might be implemented in a different way. And so giving any particular thing like an all clear stamp of approval is something that, we don't necessarily foresee happening. We could go as far as to say we've used this before, and in this context, it was approved for use. But beyond that, and I think that goes for a lot of the, like the cloud software and things like that. I think the service catalog are, it's sort of, these are things that I've used in the past, but there still needs to be some sort of review about the particular application, about how it's being used. But yeah, hopefully that would make it easier for folks within the city who are interested in using this type of technology to kind of get onboarded. And then we also mentioned, within the strategy itself, work that was being done around like the trustable tech mark or other types of third-party certifications that technologies might opt in to be a part of. And so, I think it's kind of that's sort of a new space. I think that, the city would be interested in, looking at technologies that have a certain type of certification, or, stamp of approval in terms of they're being vetted. Hopefully that answers your question a bit more.
Yeah, well, I mean, just to be very specific, like how are those things making it into the catalog that other agencies are looking at? Like, yeah.
No, I was just going to say that catalog, which is operated by Do It, I would have to kind of defer to them. If like, what's the process of how something gets into that catalog? I do, I work with them along with the Cyber Command group around specifically like IoT and what is required to, approve an IoT device. Some of the other, software that's used around the city, I would have to defer to Do It in terms of what's the approval process there.
Just a quick time
Thanks.
check. We allotted time till 10:45 with the networking and stuff. So are folks good with going through a few more questions? I know Paul and Kate, you probably have to hop off at 10:45. So I will let you, I think going through a few more questions would be great. And then if people want to stick around, or we'll stay on till 11.
Yeah, so I'll jump on this. So Daniel posted a question, which is a great one, about IoT under the lens of equity. The Bronx has no bicycle ped counters and a lot less bike infrastructure development historically. So we're actually working on a project now, which is a project that we got some grant funding from the state to do. And so this is going to be using a computer vision based technology to do bicycle and pedestrian counts. And so, obviously, depending on how computer vision is used, it can throw up some red flags. With this particular vendor that we're working with, there is a privacy by design approach. All of the there's no, with the exception of setting up the actual field of view and the counting, no video is being collected. All of the processing is happening on the device, and then the counts are being sent back to DOT. And so we are using this project as an opportunity to sort of bring more equity in where the bicycle counters and pedestrian counters are being used. And so there are some Bronx locations that are being included. It's a limited pilot. It's about, if we get to, install all of them, it'll be about a dozen, and we're trying to put them in all boroughs. And so, and then what I mentioned before, the PIA, the privacy impact assessment is going to be based around this particular project, the computer vision, because you know, I think that there could be, depending on how the computer vision is being used, some concerns around privacy. So we're using this as an opportunity to use that privacy and equity impact assessment for this particular project and get feedback on it as we're running this short-term pilot. It's going to be about an 8-month pilot to understand the use of it. And some of the reasoning behind it is with the, you know, the bike counts are mostly on the bridge crossings because they're separated from the vehicles, and so the Zelt counters that they use, they would get thrown off. And so with computer vision, we can do mixed traffic. So bikes near cars, near buses, near trucks, near sidewalks with pedestrians. So it'll give us insights that didn't previously exist. And also it's a way to potentially automate the biannual pedestrian counting that the Department of Transportation does, where they actually send people to the street for a period of time and count people. And so this is a way to automate that process and get more information than just for the short period of time that people are sent out on the street to do that manually.
I see Mark has your hand up, so please come off and ask your question.
I think you're muted, Mark.
Got the mute. I'm here. I'm curious. I mean, obviously, IoT, the power is the ability to cite trends and do predictive analysis. Now, is the City Explorer is it City Explorer using sensors to track people within borders and across borders, particularly with COVID-19? Is there any potential for helping cities manage services around the movement of people?
When you say borders, you're talking about like city limits?
It could be city limits. It could be, you know, state borders. It could be I'm just curious if there's a potential use case there for IoT.
Yeah, I mean, it's not something that that I've, you know, particularly heard about happening or that we're involved in. I know that there's data that is provided by companies that have like mobile data, companies like Streetlight Data, who kind of aggregate anonymous data from like cell towers to understand, you know, people are going from point A to point B or things like that, which was used during the pandemic, I think, to just to understand, you know, particularly in the height of the lockdowns last year, there was the recovery data partnership that the city started with different companies that were providing data. I think in that case, it was a company called SafeGraph that was used to understand like how people were moving around. That's, you know, in part where, you know, information that was gathered, like where some of the hotspots were people that were commuting more, and, you know, essential workers, basically who weren't able to work from home. So that was kind of useful data that was gathered through that means. But in terms of like dedicated mobile devices, I feel like kind of operate like in an IoT sort of like gray area. They can be IoT or they may be, you know, just a computer interface, right? Depending on how they're being used. But that's the only thing I could think about in terms of IoT.
Yeah, because a mobile phone is really just a pile of sensors.
Yeah.
Along with a CPU.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it certainly has potential there for collecting data. So, thank you.
Sure. Thank you for the question.
So we are past. I just want to check in with you, Paul and Kate. If you need to hop off, let us know. Otherwise, if you want to answer a few more questions, please feel free.
Yeah, I mean, I had a 10:30, but I've kind of already blown past it, so I'll probably just reschedule it. I
I have to hop off myself.
Okay.
I just want to say thanks so much for having us, and thanks to everyone for attending and for the questions. I'll let Paul take it from here.
Thank
you so
you.
much.
Yeah. So and thank you, Kate. Yeah, it's a great opportunity to kind of continue this conversation. So I'll stay on and continue. So we got a question about how does the city ensure resiliency with regards to Wi-Fi broadband necessary to power these devices, or is it left to partners to handle this? I'm trying to understand. So talking about connectivity and then power. So I'm trying to understand, is there a question around powering Wi-Fi devices? I don't know if Brian is on the line to, oh, sorry, connectivity, not power. Yeah, that's a good question. I know that there are, and there's a whole sort of like resiliency working group around telecommunications. That's a little bit outside of my scope of work, in terms of like the broad. We have a whole team of people, the largest team within the CTO's office, focused on broadband, and trying to implement the city's internet master plan. And I know we have, folks in the office that focus on the resiliency aspect of connectivity. But unfortunately, I don't have that answer on the top of my head, but there are resiliency plans in place around communications within the city. I can say that. Question, you mentioned IoT dashboard you were working on is available as of now. Ultimately, will the shareable IoT data be available along the rest of the city's open data, or will it be standalone portal? So those are, yeah. So again, the state of the IoT dashboard, this is mentioned in the IoT strategy. I worked with some developers to contract a proof of concept in 2019, integrating a couple of different data streams that normally wouldn't be associated with one another. Like I mentioned before, the different agencies that deploy the devices, it's the data that they use for their operations, and they typically have the immediate access to it. So the idea here is, how can we bring all different types of data into a central location? So there is a proof of concept. It's not something that's public, and at this point, that it's not ingesting data anymore. It's kind of like a historical interface that I was using to kind of get feedback from city agencies and how they might use a portal like this, a platform, to get access to data, to gather new insights based on the overlaying of different types of data that wouldn't typically be associated. For example, like the relationship between noise, traffic, and air quality in a particular part of the city. And so the idea is that, and this is going to be kind of a longer term initiative. It's in some sense like a capital project, and this is like a piece of software that would be used by the whole city agencies as well as the public. And so there's more work in terms of like securing budget and how it's going to be built out. But yeah, ultimately the idea is that the data that is non-sensitive data would be shared publicly. One of the things that we put in the IoT strategy is a belief in city agencies are gathering this data to serve the public, and we want to make the data available just like it is on the open data platform. I guess the difference is that the how close to real time is the data being available. Obviously, there are things that can be done with real time data that can't be done with data that you're analyzing from a CSV file or something like that. So planning where you're going to go based on how busy a place might be, or whether or not, like I mentioned before, the FloodNet project, we want to be able to alert people if they're if there's floodwaters in their community, if it's rising, do they need to take some sort of action, like, you know, moving their car or, you know, going somewhere else for the time being. So being able to make data that's actionable, you know, as close to real time is the idea behind that dashboard.
And how great would it be if the open data portal had real-time functionality?
Yeah, and so that's something, you know, that's been in conversation, you know, what the relationship of, you know, an IoT data dashboard would be to open data. Obviously, you know, the more times we can integrate so that there's not a proliferation of places where people need to go to find data, the better. So next question I see about, might the strategy also include the use of IoT within the cultural heritage domain, specifically integrated disaster prevention for places of worship, parks or landmarks? What existing monitoring systems are in place for fire detection, crowd control, vandalism, surveillance, etc.? Yeah, that's a good question. It's not something that has necessarily been like a particular domain focus around cultural heritage locations. You know, it sounds like some of that, you know, at least like vandalism and surveillance, some of that kind of goes into like law enforcement realms. And so that would be, you know, something that like NYPD would be handling, and, you know, through CCTV cameras or things like that. So I can't speak much into, you know, what has currently been included. If that's something that you have suggestions about, you know, I'd be happy to hear it. We have a feedback URL. So if you go to the project page, and maybe that can be something I can grab and share out to folks if it hasn't already been in the chat. But we have a feedback, we have like a feedback form. So, sorry, let me just look for that. But it's
I have it on the screen. I can pull it up.
Okay.
And I'll share it in the chat.
Okay, yeah. So if you have specific feedback, we'd love to hear it about, you know, certain areas that you're interested in applications being used with IoT. So yeah, that's what it's for. Yeah, exactly. That link on the bottom. So yeah, and that goes for anybody for any questions or comments or suggestions. You know, we're going to be compiling that and looking to address it.
All right, sorry, I'll get back to that question slide. There were a few more questions to answer.
So it's great that the city has policies for agencies on IoT. Is there any way to extend to private companies and the many public-private partnerships, like NYC, to the city engages in from both transparency and privacy perspective? Yeah, so again, I think really when the city is kind of engaging in a partnership, the contracting is sort of how that's managed. And so, you know, there are things in the contract with Link NYC in terms of like how the data is being used and things like that. And so, you know, that's really the main vehicle that the city has, is just through legal, you know, contract agreements. In terms of other, you know, things that private companies can do, you know, we do make recommendations within the strategy, trying to encourage, you know, certain types of best practices around, you know, data. There was some call outs on, you know, there's a specific sort of use case example around the Ring smart home cameras and sort of like some of the issues with that when it first rolled out, and some of the ways that they're working to address that. And so, essentially, we're putting our recommendations forward on how private companies can do that. We don't have necessarily like governance over private IoT companies, except in where we're contracting and doing business. And so, we're, as mentioned before, putting things into those contracts to, cover the principles that we've laid out around data ownership, around privacy, and things like that. Let's see. So there's a question: nudging, aka libertarian paternalism folks, nudging folks into desired behavior. The speed camera example is a good application for IoT. Are you thinking of doing some more proactive things like ranking neighborhoods, KPIs, cleanliness, noisiest, power usage to promote desirable feedback loops? I don't know. I don't think that it's being discussed broadly in that way. I think where, automated enforcement and things like that can be used, it's being done. There's also a project that DEP is doing around noise with NYU. This is a National Science Foundation project, maybe some of you have heard about, called Sonic, the Sounds of New York City. This is going back several years now. And I think that funding is, like, that project is somewhat coming to a close at the end of this year. But working with DEP, Department of Environmental Protection, who's in charge of enforcing the noise code. And so, that project is around, assessing noise. There's not really any enforcement that comes from that. A lot of times the city doesn't have the legal authority to do enforcement in that way. And so, going back to the traffic issue, a lot of that's controlled by the state. So the law needed to change in order for the city to install more of those speed cameras or red light cameras. There are limits that are imposed by the state about how that can be done. And so, I think that there's currently, dealing with transportation right now. There's a bill in the state around, trying to think of the term here, but, traffic laws and things like that, giving, city control around speed limits, around things like that. So not all of the enforcement is necessarily within the realm of the city itself. And so, yeah, it's sort of case by case basis. But yeah, I think, there are opportunities to improve on some of these quality of life issues around, the use of IoT in certain cases. There was an example that I read about in the UK where they used kind of like the traffic cameras, but for noise. So essentially, like, if a car had, kind of like an illegal modification to it that was making it really noisy, there were cameras that could not, hear the sort of the sound that was kind of violating the enforcement rules, and then it was able to take a picture of the license plate. So that was something that I read about in the UK. Stuff like that, is potentially possible. Yeah. So government is government. What are some examples of challenges you have already experienced or expect to experience soon in executing the strategy? Yeah, very true. And like, as I mentioned before, somebody had asked about, how to get agencies on board, and sort of, working on following these recommendations. I think a lot of it is going to be through the relationship building, kind of education and getting the word out, to some extent through, policy that can be put in place, like some of the, like I mentioned before, the sort of review processes around technologies. But yeah, I think anytime that there are things that potentially, like, are new processes or slow down execution of projects that can be sometimes challenging to get folks on board. But using the Smart City Collaborative network that we're putting together to kind of get the word out, to bring people together, and also show the benefits of it, around things like the privacy impact assessment. I don't think any agency wants to be deploying a technology where there's going to be controversy about it after it's installed. And there's plenty of examples in different cities where that has happened. And so, the perspective of being proactive about how technologies are being communicated, how they're being used, I think is kind of a part of the best practice that we're going to try to incorporate. It's not going to, I don't have like an illusion that's going to happen right away. These are new behaviors and new processes that we're trying to put in place. So it's going to take some time without having any kind of like hard mandate about it. And so yeah, it's going to be an education campaign internally and trying to get folks on board. So I think the challenge is going to be integrating these these principles and these initiatives into just like the ongoing workflow. But it happens over time, and people become aware, and it becomes the new normal. Another question, Joel, very prolific. I appreciate it. The velocity and volume of time series streaming data is very high, and current multi-tenant portal cannot sustain these kinds of loads. Are you looking into more appropriate federated standards based on open source technology to publish the data? Yes, I think, also understanding about, how much data is necessary. Like we've had these conversations in the development of the sort of proof of concept portal, where maybe you're taking readings, very often for certain types, but then over time you're averaging and then discarding data. So if you're, for a particular type of application, like let's say noise sensing, which is very transient, which is very different from temperature, which may exist, temperature is not going to change every 5 minutes, whereas other things might change in a much quicker rate. In some cases where you're taking a lot of measurements over time, you're averaging and discarding some of the bulk of it, and then you have longer duration averages of what might have been a lot of data points, and then you're sort of turning those into fewer data points over time. And then the last question here, this kind of data is great for powering STEAM initiatives in school. Are there courses being incorporated into the curricula to use, produce, create the data, and do a storytelling about their neighborhoods? So yeah, I mentioned this a little bit before. So, we had conversations with the DOE folks who manage the sort of CS for All, Computer Science for All program. And there is a physical computing, so like working with microcontrollers, hooking up sensors. There's not that bridge to the internet currently. And so, what I was talking about before is trying to maybe work with individual, groups of instructors or teachers for, like after school program or things like that, to try to kind of pilot something. I will say, and we mentioned this in the IoT strategy, there's an amazing program, a part of this is the Cosmos testbed in Harlem. And so this is funded by the National Science Foundation. And in Harlem, there is the Cosmos program, which is a next generation wireless research area. And there's a bunch of partners like Columbia, and Rutgers is involved, and CUNY, and others. And so they have a really great, yes, thank you for sharing, Cosmos Lab. And they have like this IoT node that they use. And so they're currently doing a bunch of really great work around IoT and STEAM. It's basically at a state where they kind of train the teachers, and then the teachers bring it to their schools. So it's a little, it's not super widespread. It's happening in different, schools, but I think that that's a really interesting model to look at to see how we can potentially grow. But, with the physical computing is still sort of growing itself. And so, it's probably gonna, take some time before it goes from like widespread physical computing curriculum to, widespread IoT, like connected device curriculum. But hopefully we're able to kind of plant the seeds now and look at things like the Cosmos program, and then maybe work with other partners to start, other kind of like after school programs around this that could be used as a model for a more, holistic curriculum that could be included. But, ultimately that's going to come down to the curriculum developers in the Department of Education. Yeah, so I think it'll be a work in progress.
Great. Well, that's it. Thank you for sticking around. Does anyone have any other final questions? I'm assuming not if your hand's not raised and there's no more in the Slido. Thank you for your questions, Joel. Paul, do you have any final words that you want to share before we wrap up?
Just, yeah, thanks everybody for coming and for the direct engagement. It would be wonderful if people, I know that there's a lot of comments and things like that in the Zoom chat as well that we didn't get to. But if anybody has questions that are relevant, or comments or anything, again, you can send them to us at the, I'll just highlight and put it in the bottom of the chat now, just so that everybody has it. But yeah, that's the place to, kind of continue to engage with us, send us thoughts, and, we're going to be incorporating that. And yeah, hopefully with some of these other initiatives, we'll have opportunity to engage like the transparency signage and the PIA, the assessments and things like that. So yeah, we'd love to have continued engagement and hear from everybody. And yeah, thanks so much for joining and for the interest.
Awesome, thank you. So normally at the end of events, we just provide space if anyone has any announcements or questions or anything to share. You can come off mute, raise your hand and come off mute and share. I'll continue forward though. If you have something, just put it in the chat, I guess is probably the best thing at this point. And then, yeah, BetaNYC has these resources for you to join us and continue talking about things with us. We also have I think somebody who is posting a bunch of questions in the Slido has a book called The Little Book of Public Space and the Internet of Things, which we recommend reading if you're into public space and IoT. And otherwise, I'll stop sharing, and thank you, Paul, thank you, Kate, for joining us today, and to the entire office of the Chief Technology Officer. We appreciate you engaging people and encourage this practice all around city government. So it's nice to see it in the works, and we're excited to hear more questions from people. We'll leave the Slido question thing open. If people continue to ask questions in there, we'll feed them over to your office. Otherwise, sounds like that link that Paul shared in the chat is a great place to put your questions or share just general feedback. And look out for more events, right? More engagement sessions that you'll be hosting in the future.
Yes.
Cool. Okay, well, with that, I'll stop recording. Goodbye, internet, as Noel says. And